I didn't want to sit up here.
We're going to be picking up this morning in the middle part of chapter 18, and hopefully we'll be finishing the trial of Jesus. I guess we're past the middle of chapter 18. We're almost to the tail end of chapter 18. But we do have a lot to try to get through again today. I want to spend just a couple of minutes, we're not going to be here long, but I want to spend a couple of minutes setting the stage again so we recall exactly where we're at, and we'll quickly run through some of the things we talked about the last 2 weeks first. So recall that Jesus' trial fell into two major phases. There was a Jewish phase of the trial and then a Roman phase of the trial. Jewish phase of the trial was where Jesus' true enemies confronted him. And they viewed Jesus as being guilty of religious offenses, and the chief one that keeps coming up, and we've seen this throughout the Gospel of John, we see him being accused of blasphemy because they don't believe his truth claims. And so that is that's what the first phase of this trial consists of. And then the second phase of the trial is the Roman phase of the trial. The Romans had to be brought in because they controlled capital punishment, as we talked about last week. That was the only thing that would satisfy the Jews. And so they knew that they had to shift the charges against Jesus a little bit. Bringing a charge of blasphemy to Rome or to Caesar really mattered little in the eyes of the Romans. So they needed to shift the charges a little bit, and the charge would be shifted in their minds to a charge of treason against Rome, in that Jesus was claiming to be an alternate king. And so that would be the charge they would bring to the Romans in order to get him essentially put to death. We looked then in some detail at Jesus' Jewish trial, and you'll recall it's interrupted a couple of times by Peter's denials, and we also talked about that last week. But essentially, John only tells us of one part of Jesus' Jewish trial, and that was the part that was before the former high priest Annas, who was still, for all intents and purposes, the godfather of Jewish religion and politics in Judea. And so during that questioning period by Annas, that's the only thing that John tells us about, and John is the only one who tells us about this questioning. During that questioning, though, it becomes apparent that Jesus is not going to receive a fair trial, that these guys have tunnel vision, and the only thing they're looking at is to figure out how to get him killed and get him out of the way. And so that was the point, that was what was going on as John told us of Jesus' Jewish trial. We also took a look briefly at some of the legal violations that occurred during this trial. We're not going to reinvent the wheel there or go through it in detail, but we talked about those last week. And then last week we got started into Jesus' Roman trial, and we saw the very first phase of that. Now, recall a couple of the things that we've identified here are, number one, throughout Jesus' arrest, his Jewish trial, and now his Roman trial, Jesus remains in charge of the situation. And his bearing and his demeanor are those of the one who's really in control of the situation. He is not a victim. And John portrays this every which way, and especially as we move through this interaction with Pilate, we will see that. And the second thing that I want you to recall from last week is that in these first few verses of Jesus and Pilate being together, we saw that Pilate gets caught. He's caught between, on one hand, the Jews and Jesus, but he's also caught in this, it's almost like theater, where he's going back and forth between two stages. When the Jews came to Pilate, they asked Pilate to come out and meet them outside, because if they went inside his Gentile home, they would be defiled and wouldn't be able to eat the Passover. So what gets set up here is this thing of changing scenes, where essentially Jesus will go outside to talk to the Jews, and then he'll come back inside to talk with Jesus. And then he goes back and forth. And this just is sort of a symbolic way of showing how Pilate is really trapped in this situation. So it's just an interesting symbol of what's going on in reality. But as this trial starts out, and last week we talked about these things, the Jews come to Pilate. Pilate asks them, what are the charges? And it's almost like they don't anticipate the question. And they say, well, just trust us. We know what we're doing, and we wouldn't bring him here if we didn't have grounds to bring him here. And Pilate says, no, not so fast. This is going to follow some format. If I'm going to sentence this guy, I need to get the information that I need. And then we saw the Jews in verse 31. The Jews they play their hand this early in the trial. They say, we have no right to execute anyone. That is what they're after. That is the only thing they want. However they can get to that decision is what they want to do. And so they've sort of played their hand already very early in the course of events here. But today we're going to pick up, starting in verse 33. After this trial has just gotten started, Pilate has gone outside, met with the Jews for their initial discussion. Now he comes back inside. Okay, and let's read starting in verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Was that your own idea," Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You're right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And with that, Pilate asked, "What is truth?" Okay? So we pick up this in verse 33, and the synoptics only give us a little snippet of this conversation. They don't give us the detail. In the synoptics, we only see Pilate asking the question, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "If you say so, yes." Or "as you say, yes." But there's a lot more detail that's given here. So in verse 33, Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This tells us that the accusing Jews must have decided that that was going to be their angle of prosecution. That was the charge they were going to level against Jesus, was that he was, as we've said before, an alternate king in competition with Caesar. Now in that would bring him into conflict with Rome and would create some problems with Rome. But the beauty of this accusation, if you're one of those Jews, is that it sort of has two heads. In saying Jesus is a king, for the Jews, they can see that as Jesus being their religious king. Okay? Is he their religious king? And then on the side of the Romans, are you really a threat to Caesar? Are you an alternate to Caesar? So there's sort of two different questions here. And in verse 34, Jesus sees that. He identifies that, and he says, "Is that your idea, or have others talked to you?" In other words, Pilate, are you asking me for the Roman reasons, if I'm a threat to Caesar? Or are you asking me because the Jews think I'm a threat to them? And so in being their king, they're going to acknowledge that I am God's son.
If you look at the way he answered Pilate, he threw a healthy dose of gasoline on that fire.
Oh, yeah.
Intensely. You could see that he was trying to push this thing over the edge, I guess.
He knows where this has to end up, and this is and I'm going to talk about this at the end, how we get torn in the process here, because we want for Jesus to be treated fairly. We don't want him to be falsely accused. But on the other hand, the only thing that was going to get him on the cross was a false accusation. Otherwise, he's going to be innocent. So that's the only way this could happen. And Jesus does. He lights the fuse. He throws gasoline on it, whatever is necessary. Okay, so in verse 34, Jesus asks Pilate, okay, is that your take on this situation? And I need to be concerned about you thinking I'm a threat to Rome? Or are you asking for the sake of the Jews and whether I am their Messiah or not? Okay? Pilate, though, doesn't really answer the question. He just shows that he's indignant with the whole situation when he says, "Am I a Jew?" Am I one of those dirty scoundrels? You're putting me in that class, you think? Okay. The affairs of the Jews were not important to Pilate. He could care less, other than keeping a lid on whatever was going to happen. But he must have realized there's something to this, because he says to Jesus again, what is it that you've done? How have you triggered this type of a problem, this sort of a disagreement amongst your own people? How did this ever come about? And now Jesus, in verse 36, he answers Pilate's question. He answers the original question. When Pilate said, are you a king of the Jews? And Jesus says, yes, I am a king, but... And he gives what we would consider a negative qualifier, telling what his kingdom is not. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. It is from another place. I am not a threat to you. Okay? And that's not to mean that Jesus doesn't have authority in the world. But it means that his authority and his demonstration of power that he has shown throughout his life in public, that all of that is from another place. It's not from earthly politics. Okay? This is not what's going on here. So, in verse 37 then, Pilate and Jesus kind of come to an understanding. Pilate affirms that Jesus is a king, and Jesus affirms that he's a king. But this time Jesus says also not just what his kingdom isn't, but he describes what his kingdom is. And he says, I was born for this. I was born to be a king. And I came into the world to testify to truth. Now that sounds like John, doesn't it? Yeah. This is John emphasizing once again his story of Jesus presenting his Father to the world and testifying to the world of the realities and the truthfulness of his claims. And so at the tail end of this, Jesus adds on this little statement here. He says, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And within that statement, there's an invitation to Pilate even. It's an invitation to Pilate. Why don't you believe? You listen to me. You believe here. And so there's that invitation even to Pilate. But Pilate doesn't get it. Pilate cynically answers Jesus. And I can just hear him sneering when he says it. What is truth? You know? And it's just, how can I believe what you're telling me? What evidence is there for that? Greg?
What's interesting about that is Pilate's wife got it. She understood.
Oh, yeah.
But he didn't.
She knew there was some special problems. She had gotten a special message, though, too.
She may not have had the whole picture, but she knew enough.
We learned that from the Synoptics. John doesn't bother with that detail because it's not so pertinent for his part of the story, as he's focusing on the bearing of Jesus. But when you think about this middleman position that Pilate is walking, his wife is on the other side of this thing too. So Pilate is really in a tough place here. Okay, so now we get to the tail end of verse 38. Pilate now, he's been inside talking to Jesus, now he's going back outside to negotiate with the Jews. And he's clearly determined that Jesus is not a threat to them, to him. And so he seeks another way to pacify the Jews. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that a crowd has been gathering, okay? This thing started as kind of a quiet kangaroo court during the middle of the night, but as things are moving forward, the crowd is gathering outside there. And now there's a lot of people there. And maybe Pilate is thinking that he can appeal to this mass. He knows Jesus at one time has been really popular, and it wasn't very long ago. And so maybe he can shift them by working on the whole crowd. So he heads back outside, and he essentially proposes a prisoner exchange. So let's read starting in verse 38, the last part of it. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? And they shouted back, no, not him, give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. When Pilate said to the crowd, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? This is a dig. Do you want me to release your king? This guy? who they want killed. You know, it's a real dig, and he's mocking Jesus, and he's mocking them all in the same sentence. So this Pilate isn't without some cunning attributes, that's for sure. In his eyes, though, this whole thing is nothing more than just a religious squabble. What's the point? What's the point? Why is Rome involved here? But unfortunately, he has badly misjudged their fervor, their fever, their enthusiasm for what they are involved in. And in fact, from this point forward, these Jews are not going to be sidetracked. There is no logic to their thinking. There is no rationality to their thinking. There is no understanding or consideration in their thinking. They're filled with frenzy and emotion, and it's a mob mentality that is filling them up. And the leaders are inciting this the farther it goes. Now, what was Barabbas' crime? He was a robber, but he was more than that. He had also participated in an insurrection, a rebellion against Rome. So he was an enemy of Rome. And in the process of that insurrection, he had killed people. So he had committed murder too. This guy was a bad dude, okay? So don't miss, and it's one of those other moments that we run into in this trial that's just filled with such irony. Don't miss this irony. The Jews are demanding that Barabbas be released. He has committed murder while participating in an uprising against Rome. Meanwhile, they're also demanding the execution, the murder of Jesus, who is not guilty of any crime and is no threat to Rome. Now let that sink in for a couple of minutes, huh? Greg?
Well, I've always found it interesting that Pilate would do that, knowing that he is a threat to Rome, based on their customs. It's your custom that we use. So it's surprising that Rome would do that.
Well, it gives us an idea of how far he's trying to push the olive branch out there. You know, he knows this is a volatile situation. He recognizes the bad place he's in, and it's only going to get worse as we go through the rest of the morning. And so it's important that he make every chance he can to work this. But that's what this was all about. This releasing a prisoner at Passover was just simply a way that he could pacify the Jews. And that's what this was all about.
In other words, he had a tinderbox here and he wanted
Yeah.
flames on it.
He needed to defuse it as best he could. Lamar?
But you can see how God adds another element to this by picking this guy
Yeah.
with all of his stuff, that Jesus is going to die for him as well.
That's right.
And we don't have to think about that, but we talked about this one Sunday, I think you were gone that week, how Barabbas knew he was going to die for what he did, and now all of a sudden he shows up back home, talking to his family, and they said, what happened? And they said, hey, they let me go and they got this other guy. So now Jesus is dying in his stead,
That's right.
like he died in ours.
That's right. So, and then the other irony that this presents. What does the word Barabbas, what's the name Barabbas mean?
Oh, I knew that.
Bar is the son of
Yeah.
Abba, Father, the son of the Father. Daddy's boy. This is Daddy's boy. But think about it. You've got Barabbas is named Daddy's boy, but you've got Jesus,
Daddy's boy.
who is exactly like his father. He is exactly like his father. He's Daddy's boy in every way. And John has been pointing that out to us for 18 and a half chapters now. Okay? How he is just like his father. And what's more, when people look at him, they see his father in him. Wow. And that is what this all is about. That he is indeed his father's son. We get next into chapter 19, and in this little section here, Pilate has Jesus flogged or scourged. He's actually still negotiating with the Jews. His attempt to get him traded for Barabbas hasn't worked, but he's got another idea now. And so this, the flogging or the scourging consisted of a whipping, which you've heard described many times. We're not going to spend a lot of detail on it, but just suffice it to say that a lot of people did not survive the whipping and the scourging process. In Roman courts, this was legal to do even though the accused had not yet been convicted. And Roman courts could use this as a means to induce a confession. Okay? And so that's perhaps what's going on. A Roman citizen could not be treated in that way. But if you were not a Roman citizen, and Jesus was not, you could be treated in this way. Let's read 19:1-7, and let's take a look at why Pilate had Jesus flogged then, at this point. And what we're going to see is it's another attempt to get Jesus released, really. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out, said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." And when Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." In verses 2 and 3, John describes the mockery of those soldiers and how cruel they were. They put this crown on him that was intended to provide both physical and emotional torture to him. They put a robe on him that made him look like a king. This is immediately after this horrible, horrible scourging. They taunt him, calling him their king. Or no, calling him the king of the Jews. These are Roman soldiers. They're calling him, you're their king. And they hit him or slap him in the face. Think how personal that is. You know, we think a lot about combat today, and the one thing I'll say about most combat in today's world is it's at a distance. Combat these days was personal. It was face to face. It was blow to blow. And what a different type of warfare. What a different type of punishment that was. You know, I was thinking on the way over this morning, people then were used to watching people die. They saw it. They saw it all the time.
No big deal.
I bet if I had you raise your hands, there'd be more people here that have never seen a person die than those that have seen a person die. We are so isolated from that. But this was part of their life back in those days. I'm sorry, Jerry, I ignored you a minute ago.
In this case, would Pilate have the power to let Jesus go? Because besides no
He could have, yes. He could have said, "You're not going to execute him on my watch." You know, he certainly could have done that. And then the Jews would have had to have taken it into their courts and figured out, you know, whatever they could do. But
When it comes down to it, everybody's worried about their own skin.
sure.
Nobody wants to truly do the right thing because it's going to cause problems for ourselves.
Yeah, what's the cost?
You know, it's the sin of humanity.
That's right.
Such
Ben?
Well, Pilate was the governor of the state, but he was afraid that the emperor would come down because
Right.
the emperor already told him, "You better take care of all these Jews."
We're going to get into that. That's still to come here. We'll get that. That's sort of the Jews' final shot at Pilate here. We'll get there in a minute. So we see this mockery of Jesus, and then in verses 4 to 5, Pilate goes out and he tells them he's going to bring Jesus out. And he repeats his conclusion that he has found no reason for what they're asking for. And then he brings Jesus out. What a sight that had to be. He's dressed in these play clothes. He's beat to a pulp. He's torn, he's bloodied, he's emaciated, he's weakened. There's just nothing left of him. And Pilate says, here's your king. Wow, that's the way he was treated. His hope is that if he presents Jesus as being worthless and no threat to anybody, maybe we can get out of this thing without having an execution today. That's his hope. But that is not going to satisfy them. In verses 6 and 7, the chief priests and their officials are still egging the crowd on. And under their leadership, they smell the blood in the water, and they attack even more aggressively. Now they're demanding his crucifixion. Pilate still sees this as an internal Jewish affair, and sarcastically he says, just do it yourself. He knows they can't do it, but he's got nowhere to turn. He's in no man's land here. Okay? And he repeats for the third time now that he finds no reason to put this man to death. But then in verse 7, the Jews really lay it out there. And they say this is a violation of our law. And the law they're referring to is Leviticus 24, verse 16, where the text says, anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. And of course, they view all of Jesus' claims and all of his teaching as being blasphemous. This no longer is so much about Jesus being a threat to Rome. They have uncovered their real reason for what's going on. Now, remember I've told you several times that the whole gospel is told in the prologue. Here's chapter 1, verse 11. He came, Jesus did, to that which was his own people, his own nation. But his own did not receive him. That is the summary of the whole thing. Now in verses 8 through 11, we're going to see Pilate's final question to Jesus. Pilate heard that the Jews were saying he claims to be the Son of God, and this made him, according to the text, even more afraid.
Question. There's an apprehension, obviously, of Pilate to carry the wishes of the Jews. I wonder how much the urging of his wife is playing into his apprehension. You know, because that's still in the back of his mind.
Sure.
No matter what drama's playing
Sure.
out. This dream of his wife concerning this guy had to be messing with his head.
He is literally in no man's land. And we've talked about the fact that he's outside, he's inside, he's trying to walk the middle, and now he's got the Jews on one hand, he's got Jesus on another, he's got his wife in the back door. You know, I mean, it just, where does he turn? And he's becoming increasingly frustrated, exasperated. What course do I have here? How can I fix this thing?
And he took some reasonable doors trying to get out.
He sure tried hard.
Yeah.
He sure tried hard. You know, he pushed that olive branch, I think, as far as he could to get this thing settled down.
With his wife, I mean.
What's that?
Pilate's wife, how did, she seemed like,
Well, she wasn't a follower of Jesus.
No, she didn't seem to be a follower. She just had dreams and messages during the night, and they raised some alarms in Jesus. She warned Pilate, don't have anything to do with this man. He's trouble. And so, you know, the Romans are superstitious people. Okay? So when they get messages in dreams and stuff, that means something to them. And it's going to mean something right now, because this idea that Jesus is the Son of a God, wait a minute, Pilate says, if that's true, I don't need him on my case too. You know, I don't need this God punishing me. Now, their views of gods were completely different. You know, the mythology you learned in history was Rome, and that's what their belief system was. But nonetheless, Pilate realizes he already knew he was in a bad place, but now he realizes this could even get worse now. Okay, and so Pilate now goes back inside again to ask Jesus some more questions. And here we go in verse 8. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. He went back inside the palace, "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. And then Pilate gets angry. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Whew. The temperature is going up in here, right?
But Jesus is still under control.
Right.
Well, the phrase in there that I guess I have a big question about is the greater sin. We've
Okay.
always been taught that sin is sin is sin. Like, this is greater sin.
Yeah. That should challenge us, shouldn't it? That should challenge us. Okay? I'm not going to answer that one. I want you to think about it, because it was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you. Just leave it there. You need to think about that. You need to think about that. When can a sin be bigger than another sin? Because there are. Okay?
Yeah.
There are sins that affect many others. There are sins that are individual. So you got to think outside the box in terms of sin. It's not just an individual thing. Anyhow,
God hates people that plan sin in their
Yeah.
heart. They put thought and energy. This is what's going on here. But you know, a lot of times something will happen and it'll be immediate, whereas somebody else dwells on and thinks
Right.
about how to do these things.
there's a lot of different things, and you should challenge yourself to think about different types of sins. I mean, you know, we know about sins of omission, sins of commission. Is there a difference between them? What's the difference? What's the fix? You know, and there are differences. The scriptures teach that too. But the overall consequence of sin is a common one. Okay, so that's what we usually focus on when we have that discussion. But there are other things to consider in terms of sinfulness.
Another, just a quick thought.
Quick.
Anybody that makes stumbles
Causes
causes a child
someone
to
to-
stumble.
Yeah.
That's a serious sin.
Mark?
I think that what happens is we try to judge the seriousness of one sin versus another on our level, but on God's level of looking at it,
You're all healthy.
this is an entirely different thing.
That's right.
And there are levels, but it still turns out as far as we're concerned, sin.
Yeah. The consequence is a common consequence.
Right.
Yep. Okay, back to verse 9 here. Pilate's question, "Where are you from, Jesus?" This is the central focus of this whole gospel. Do you believe that Jesus is from where he says he is from? Pilate is asking the question that the Jews should have been asking. Where are you from, Jesus? And at the moment, Jesus doesn't respond because he's already answered. He told him in verse 37 of the previous chapter, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world. It's from another place." In verse 10, Pilate is incensed by Jesus' silence. He makes it clear that he is in charge, or so he thinks. But then we get Jesus' last response to Pilate when he says, "Any power that you have has been granted to you by God, by my Father, not Rome." This has little to do with Rome.
And shouldn't that bring us a sense of peace?
Absolutely.
No matter what we're going through, no matter what, God's ordained it,
Who's in control?
because
That's right.
otherwise we wouldn't be in. I mean, God has us, whatever it is that we have to face.
Absolutely. Verse 11 gives us Jesus' final response to Pilate when he says, "Any power you have is granted to you by God." And so he challenges Pilate's authority. And then he says this phrase that is a little bit troubling and ambiguous. "The one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Now, it's also been debated, in addition to what's the greater sin all about, but who's he referring to here? And, well, some people have gone the direction of Judas, but when you think about it, Judas is kind of out of the... Oh, the Jews, okay. Well, some people think Judas. I'm going to start there. But the problem with thinking Judas is this is because Judas is out of the picture now. And Judas didn't directly hand Jesus over to Pilate.
No.
Okay, so that's a little iffy. The Jews, maybe, but the problem there is that this clearly says in verse 11, the one is singular. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is singular. Okay? It still could refer to the group of Jews being treated as a unit. That's possible. The other possibility is that maybe he's talking about Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the one that hatched this whole plot, you remember? And he is the one who directly has just tried Jesus and handed him over to Pilate for sentencing. Caiaphas is the one, he's the acting high priest. He's the one who should know better. He should have known better. So at this point in time, I think when I started this study, I probably would have gone with the Jews, but I think right now I'm in the Caiaphas camp.
Yeah.
Really, Caiaphas was one of the Jews, so
Yeah.
maybe it's the same camp, who knows? And it's not terribly important to know the answer to that question. But now we get to chapter 19, verses 12 through 16, and we get Pilate sentencing Jesus to death.
Actually, the one that could have controlled this whole mess was Annas.
Sure.
The Godfather.
The Godfather could have shut this thing down too.
Immediately. So he stamped it and said, pass it on.
That's right. That's right.
I never, this study, learning about Annas better in his relationship to Caiaphas and the whole situation, and looking at him like the Godfather, and that was really interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's certainly possible that, you know, his presence is there, obviously shepherding this whole thing along, and maybe he's the one Jesus is referring to as well. I don't know. But when we get to these last verses now, between 12 and 16, the Jews still have one bullet in their chamber, and they're about to fire it. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king, as Jesus is doing, opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Verse 12, the Jews play their final card, which leaves Pilate stranded and no place to turn. Pilate had already offended the Jews because of his harshness, his ruthlessness. We've seen his sneering quality, his pride, his arrogance. And even in this trial, the little snippets we see of his personality reveal him as a vindictive man. The Jews had already complained to Tiberius, the emperor, about Pilate. Rome only wanted two things from its governors. They wanted him to keep a lid on the situation so that they didn't have to send their army to the provinces to quell a rebellion or anything, and they wanted to keep the tax money flowing. Those are the two things that Rome wanted out of their governors. But now the Jews are threatening Pilate because they're saying, if you view yourself as being an agent of Caesar, you cannot let this man go. Otherwise, we've got channels, and we will report you again. And so even though Pilate is convinced Jesus is innocent, it's as Jamie said a few minutes ago, he really has no choice that he can discern at this moment. Verses 13 through 15, they tell us that this final shot of the Jews was decisive, and it was effective, because Pilate caves in, and he immediately brings Jesus out for sentencing. It's interesting that John records both the time and the location that this sentence is passed. It just lends itself again to the credibility of this eyewitness account. And Pilate makes his last sneering, cynical comments as he says, "Here's your king. Shall I crucify your king?"
The Jews do the same thing. They make their last and final statement. We have no other king but Caesar.
And what is that statement made by the chief priests? It's that same word. It's blasphemy. Not accepting God as their king. We have no king but Caesar. And this is now the chief priests of the nation who make this statement. And that's how this thing ends.
Which again, goes back and reminds you of all of the things that Jesus said to the religious leaders up to this point about who they really were.
Yeah.
Here it is right here.
Blind guides, snakes.
Root of life.
Okay, I forgot to push this several times. But I want for us to go back and refresh our minds.
It's interesting that John doesn't record Pilate washing his hands.
Yeah. That's not the central thing for John. John is focused on the result, the reason for the result, and then how Jesus handled this all. And we see Jesus in control. And this is what I want us to focus on as we conclude this section. Let's look back through the arrest, through his trials, and let's see that Jesus is indeed not a powerless victim. First of all, in chapter 18 and verse 4, John told us parenthetically, Jesus knew everything that was going to take place. Okay? In verse 6, as the party came to arrest him, the text tells us that arresting party, when they saw Jesus' bearing, they withdrew and they fell back. In chapter 18, verse 11, again, as they're arresting him, Jesus states, "I am determined to drink my Father's cup." That is my purpose here. It's not to save my life. My purpose.
He shows his power in healing.
Yeah.
The ear.
Yeah. In chapter 18, verse 23, when he's smacked in the face by the high priest's official because of the way he answered the high priest, he came back and defended himself. He said, "Testify. If you've got evidence against me, testify." Okay? Show me what you're really all about. Chapter 18, verse 36, Jesus said, "I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. It comes from another place." And then he goes in the very next sentence, and he says, "My mission is to testify to the truth, and everyone who loves truth listens to me." And then in chapter 19, verse 11, as he concludes with Pilate, he reminds Pilate that any power you have, fella, was given to you from above. It has nothing to do with your emperor or even Rome.
You know, we have to keep one thing in mind here, that Jesus is also God. So technically, these are his people that he has taken care of all the way back to Egypt. And now they have the audacity to say in his face, "We have no other king
But Caesar. Yeah.
What a heartbreak for him.
Jesus was never powerless through this whole thing. This was his choice. Jesus was not particularly concerned about whether he'd get a fair trial. In fact, he needed to be found guilty. In order for him to fulfill his mission and do what he came to do, he had to be convicted. And so we find ourselves, I find myself in a no man's land here too. And this is what I was talking about earlier today. I really want for Jesus not to have to go through this. I really want for him not to be tortured and executed in the way that this plays out. I really want for him to be treated fairly and not unjustly condemned.
But you also want him crucified.
But I need him on that cross. And so do you. So, I thank him from the bottom of my heart.
Okay?
And there's a song that we sing from time to time. We're going to close with this morning. This is just the tail end of the chorus of this song. It's been kind of haunting me for the past couple of weeks as I've been getting ready for this. He still came, just for me. He still came. Knowing all he would endure, he still came. Disregarding every cost, from the manger to the cross, he still came just for me. He still came. And that's where we're left this week. Next week we pick up with the gruesome scenes at Calvary. And we're not going to spend, you know this part of the story. We've talked about this story a lot. Instead, once again, I want for us to try to look at it from John's perspective and ask the question, what is the message John's trying to convey to us here? Okay? And that's where we'll go next week. God is good.